Sometimes the smallest hearts carry the greatest courage. The towering crystal chandeliers of Blackwood Palace cast warm golden light across a dining hall built to impress kingdoms and humble rivals. More than 300 guests filled the long tables, their polished silver goblets sparkling beside towering floral arrangements, while musicians played soft melodies beneath banners embroidered with the royal wolf crest. Every noble sat perfectly still, careful not to break the unspoken rules of the Alpha King's annual royal dinner. King Adrian Blackwood ruled from the head of the grand table with the calm confidence that made even seasoned warriors lower their eyes. His presence filled the room without a single raised voice. Yet hidden behind the endless rows of servants stood someone almost no one noticed. Emma Carter adjusted the sleeves of her simple gray uniform as she quietly carried another tray toward the kitchen doors. She never expected anyone to remember her name. To the nobles, she was only another Omega whose purpose was to remain invisible. She had learned long ago that disappearing often hurt less than hoping to belong. Still, every evening she carried one secret treasure no one else possessed. Two young wolf pups waited for her smile as if it were the brightest sunrise in the kingdom. Noah and Liam, the Alpha King's spirited nephews, ignored nearly every royal tutor, every decorated knight, and every expensive entertainer brought into the palace. But whenever Emma appeared, their little faces lit up with excitement that no lesson or toy had ever inspired. They followed her through quiet hallways, begged for bedtime stories, laughed at her gentle jokes, and proudly declared that her cinnamon rolls tasted better than anything served in the royal kitchens. Most adults dismissed it as childish affection. They never noticed the way the boys watched Emma whenever she thought no one was looking, as though they sensed the quiet loneliness she tried so hard to hide behind kind eyes and patient smiles. Tonight, however, something felt different. Emma paused beside one of the tall palace windows and caught the reflection of elegantly dressed guests, laughing together beneath the glowing chandeliers. For just a heartbeat, she wondered what it might feel like to belong at one of those tables instead of standing behind them. She quickly shook the thought away before anyone could notice the sadness crossing her face. Across the magnificent dining hall, two small pairs of bright eyes had already seen everything, and without speaking a single word, Noah and Liam silently reached the exact same impossible decision. Noah glanced toward Liam, and without exchanging a single word, the brothers smiled with the kind of silent agreement only children who had grown up together could understand. Emma had taught them that kindness did not always need grand speeches. Sometimes it was hidden inside a warm cookie, a bedtime story, or a hand resting gently on a frightened shoulder. Tonight, they wanted to return even a tiny piece of that kindness. Earlier that afternoon, while the palace buzzed with endless preparations for the royal dinner, Emma had spent nearly an hour helping the boys shape little wolves from leftover bread dough. Their tiny hands had become covered in flour, and their laughter had echoed through the quiet bakery, until one of the royal chefs jokingly declared they had created more flour clouds than bread. Emma only laughed with them, brushing white powder from Noah's nose before carefully placing each tiny loaf into the oven. For those few peaceful moments, the grand palace had not felt cold or intimidating. It had felt like a home. But that feeling vanished as soon as one of the noblewomen entered the kitchen searching for imported pastries. She barely acknowledged Emma except to remind another servant that Omega should remain out of sight once the guests arrived because celebrations looked more elegant without unnecessary distractions. Emma answered with her usual gentle smile and lowered her eyes, pretending the words had drifted past like an ordinary breeze. Noah heard every syllable. Liam did too. They watched Emma quietly return to arranging silver trays without defending herself or showing even the smallest trace of anger. Somehow that made the words hurt even more. The brothers had asked Emma many times why she never became upset when people spoke to her that way. She always answered with the same soft voice. She would kneel until she was eye level with them and say, "People often carry storms inside themselves. If I answer every storm with another storm, nobody will ever see the sunshine." Noah had never fully understood those words. He only knew Emma deserved smiles instead of sadness. As evening settled over Blackwood Palace, guests continued arriving in elegant carriages lined with polished lanterns. The enormous dining hall slowly filled with conversations, crystal glasses, and carefully practiced laughter. Musicians tuned their instruments while servants carried steaming dishes from the kitchens with perfect timing. Every detail had been rehearsed for weeks because nothing less than perfection was expected beneath King Adrian's roof. Emma moved through the room almost like a quiet breeze, making certain every guest had what they needed before disappearing into the background again. She never interrupted conversations. She never asked for recognition. Even King Adrian, seated beneath the royal crest, seemed entirely focused on welcoming diplomats and neighboring leaders. Yet from across the hall, Noah noticed Emma pause for only a second after hearing another table laugh behind her. She looked toward the palace gardens beyond the tall windows, took one slow breath, and forced another gentle smile onto her face before continuing her work. Liam tugged softly on Noah's sleeve. Neither brother spoke. They simply looked from Emma to the magnificent dining hall filled with rules, polished manners, and very serious adults. Then both little wolves grinned with growing excitement. If the palace insisted on protecting perfect dinners more than kind hearts, perhaps tonight perfection was about to become wonderfully impossible. The first sign of trouble arrived disguised as perfect innocence. Noah climbed onto his chair and stared thoughtfully at the magnificent centerpiece stretching nearly 12 feet across the royal table. Hundreds of white roses surrounded glowing candles, polished crystal figures, and silver vines woven so carefully that every guest had admired them upon entering the hall. Liam followed his brother's gaze, his bright blue eyes sparkling with the same mischievous curiosity that had gotten them into harmless trouble more than once before. Emma noticed the familiar expressions immediately. She quietly walked toward them carrying a basket of warm dinner rolls and gave the boys the gentle smile they knew so well. "Please remember," she whispered softly, "this dinner is very important to your uncle." Both little wolves nodded with perfect sincerity. For exactly 3 seconds, Noah leaned toward Liam and whispered something that made his brother bite his lip to stop himself from laughing. Emma sighed, already recognizing the beginning of another adventure, although she had no idea how large this one might become. Across the hall, ambassadors discussed trade agreements while musicians filled the room with graceful melodies. Every servant moved in careful rhythm, almost like dancers who had memorized every step. The palace steward proudly observed the flawless service, convinced this would become the most successful royal banquet in years. Meanwhile, beneath the enormous tablecloth, 2 tiny pairs of feet quietly disappeared from view. Emma blinked. "Noah," she whispered. No answer. "Liam." Silence. Her heart skipped as she gently set down the basket and looked beneath the table. The boys had already crawled away between rows of chairs with astonishing speed. Emma excused herself politely and hurried after them, careful not to disturb the distinguished guests. She finally spotted 2 small heads peeking from behind an elaborate dessert display. Before she could reach them, Noah picked up one of the miniature bread wolves they had baked together earlier that afternoon. He placed it proudly on the edge of a nobleman's polished dinner plate with the biggest grin imaginable. Liam immediately added another tiny bread wolf beside an expensive silver goblet. The puzzled nobleman looked down, completely speechless. Emma hurried over and apologized with genuine embarrassment while gently retrieving the little bread figures. The boys giggled so hard they nearly fell onto the carpet. Several nearby guests smiled, despite themselves. Others exchanged confused glances, unsure whether to laugh or remain properly dignified. Emma knelt beside the brothers and quietly reminded them that kindness also meant respecting the hard work everyone had poured into the evening. Noah lowered his eyes for a moment, appearing almost convinced. Then he glanced toward Emma's face again. He noticed that although she was smiling for their sake, the sadness had never truly left her eyes. Liam noticed it too. The brothers looked at each other once more, and something silently changed between them. Their first little prank had earned only tiny smiles. That was not enough. They wanted to hear Emma laugh the way she had in the bakery, with flour on her cheeks and sunlight in her eyes. If one playful surprise could not bring that joyful sound back, then perhaps they simply needed a much bigger surprise. Noah suddenly jumped onto an empty chair and raised both hands with all the confidence of a tiny king preparing to address his kingdom. "Attention!" he announced in a voice that carried much farther than anyone expected. Conversations across the dining hall slowed as dozens of curious eyes turned toward him. Liam quickly climbed onto the neighboring chair, trying very hard to look just as important. Emma's heart nearly stopped. "Noah," she whispered, taking a careful step forward. Please come down." Instead, Noah smiled brightly at the nearest musicians and gave an enthusiastic wave. Unsure whether this was part of some planned entertainment, one violinist hesitantly played a cheerful melody. Liam immediately began swaying to the music, encouraging his brother with delighted applause. A few younger guests smiled. Several older nobles frowned in quiet confusion. Emma reached the boys just as Noah declared that every royal dinner needed more laughter because serious faces made the food taste lonely. A ripple of surprised chuckles spread through one side of the hall before quickly fading beneath uncertain silence. The palace steward looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. Emma gently took Noah's little hand, hoping to guide both brothers back toward their seats. For a brief moment it almost worked. Then Liam spotted a silver serving cart filled with colorful fruit tarts waiting to be presented later in the evening. His eyes widened with inspiration. Before Emma could react, he rolled the cart only a few feet across the polished floor, while announcing that desserts should visit the guests instead of waiting for guests to visit desserts. The cart stopped safely, but several tiny pastries wobbled playfully, making nearby children burst into laughter. Their parents struggled to remain dignified, although a few smiles escaped despite their best efforts. Emma quickly steadied the cart and quietly thanked the kitchen staff for their patience. She apologized again and again, her cheeks warming with embarrassment. Noah noticed her worried expression and gently tugged on her sleeve. "We almost made you laugh," he whispered hopefully. Emma looked into the eager faces of the two little wolves and felt something inside her heart soften. They had not wanted attention for themselves. They had only wanted to chase away the sadness they believed they had seen in her eyes. She could not be upset with such innocent intentions. A tiny laugh escaped before she managed to hide it. It lasted only a second, but Noah and Liam looked at one another, as if they had just accomplished the greatest victory in the world. They cheered quietly and wrapped their small arms around Emma in an affectionate hug that nearly made her forget where they were. Unfortunately, not everyone shared the same warm reaction. At a nearby table, Lady Beatrice Ashcroft slowly lowered her crystal glass and watched the scene with narrowed eyes. Her voice remained calm, but every word carried the sharp chill of winter. "A royal banquet is no place for childish disorder," she remarked loudly enough for surrounding guests to hear. And perhaps certain servants encourage far too much familiarity. The joyful warmth surrounding Emma disappeared almost instantly. She lowered her eyes, stepped back from the boys, and folded her hands respectfully. Noah's smile faded. Liam's cheerful excitement disappeared as well. For the first time that evening, both little wolves realized their playful mission had accidentally placed the person they loved most in an uncomfortable position, and somewhere at the head of the royal table, King Adrian had quietly witnessed every single moment. An uneasy silence settled over the magnificent dining hall like a cloud drifting across the moon. Even the musicians lowered their instruments, uncertain whether the evening should continue. Lady Beatrice folded her hands gracefully and offered King Adrian a polite smile that barely concealed her disapproval. "Your Majesty," she said with practiced elegance, "discipline is one of the foundations of a respected kingdom. Affection is admirable, but without proper boundaries, even the finest household loses its dignity." Several nobles nodded in quiet agreement. Others kept their eyes lowered, unwilling to choose a side before hearing the Alpha King's response. Emma stepped forward before anyone else could speak. Her heart pounded, yet her voice remained calm. "Your Majesty, this misunderstanding is my responsibility." The young masters meant no disrespect. If anyone should answer for the interruption, it should be me. Noah's eyes grew wide with disbelief. Liam immediately grabbed Emma's hand. "No," he whispered. "It was our idea." Emma gently squeezed his little fingers without looking at him. "Everything is all right," she said softly. "Sometimes adults simply need a little quiet." The words carried the same warmth she always used when comforting frightened children. Yet tonight they sounded different. They carried the quiet strength of someone willing to protect others, even at personal cost. King Adrian remained perfectly still at the head of the table. His silver eyes rested on Emma for several long moments before shifting toward his nephews. Noah lowered his head for the first time all evening. Liam's shoulders sank as guilt slowly replaced excitement. Around them, servants stood frozen beside silver platters, uncertain whether to continue serving dinner or quietly retreat toward the kitchens. The palace steward had already begun imagining tomorrow's reports describing the evening as a royal embarrassment. Lady Beatrice spoke once more, her voice smooth as polished marble. The children are young, of course. They merely followed the example placed before them. Her gaze drifted toward Emma. Perhaps the palace has forgotten that kindness without order eventually becomes disorder itself. Emma felt every eye in the room settle upon her. She wanted nothing more than to disappear into the background as she always had. Instead, she bowed respectfully and answered with gentle honesty. If my presence has diminished this evening in any way, I sincerely apologize. I never wished to bring attention to myself. Noah suddenly stepped forward before anyone could stop him. His small voice echoed clearly through the silent hall. She never wants attention. That is why we wanted everyone to see her smile. Liam nodded quickly, tears beginning to gather in his bright eyes. She smiles for everybody else every day. Nobody smiles for her. The simple words floated through the enormous room with unexpected weight. Conversations did not resume. Crystal glasses remained untouched. Even the palace servants seemed to forget their carefully rehearsed movements. King Adrian slowly looked around the grand hall, studying the expressions of nobles, advisors, musicians, and servants alike. Then his gaze returned to Emma, who still stood quietly with her head lowered, asking for nothing, defending everyone except herself. For the first time that evening, the Alpha King was no longer watching a disrupted royal banquet. He was watching a truth that had remained hidden inside his own palace for far longer than anyone had realized. King Adrian slowly rose from his seat, and the quiet murmur that had begun spreading across the hall disappeared as completely as a candle beneath glass. No one dared speak. Every noble, every servant, every musician watched him with careful attention, expecting a firm command that would restore the perfect order of the evening. Emma lowered her head even farther, preparing herself to accept whatever decision he believed was fair. Noah instinctively stepped closer to her left side, while Liam quietly held her other hand. Neither boy seemed interested in hiding anymore. King Adrian descended the short marble steps from the royal platform, without haste. His polished boots echoed softly across the floor until he stopped only a few feet from Emma. For a long moment he said nothing. Instead, he looked first at Noah, then at Liam, and finally at the young Omega who still refused to raise her eyes. "Emma," he said in a calm voice that carried effortlessly through the vast chamber, "look at me." She hesitated only briefly before lifting her gaze. There was no anger waiting for her. There was only quiet curiosity. "Tell me honestly," the Alpha King continued, "did you ask these two young wolves to interrupt tonight's dinner?" Emma immediately shook her head. "Never, Your Majesty. I reminded them many times that tonight was important. They only wished to make me smile. They did not understand the consequences." Noah quickly looked up. "That is true. We wanted her to laugh like she did this afternoon." Liam nodded eagerly. She forgot how to laugh after people were unkind. King Adrian listened without interruption. Then he turned toward the assembled guests. "Interesting," he said thoughtfully. "The children noticed something that many adults standing in this room never did." His words settled gently over the hall, yet they carried undeniable weight. Lady Beatrice shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. King Adrian looked back at Emma. "For months I have received reports praising the discipline of my household, the excellence of my staff, and the harmony within these walls. Yet not one report mentioned the person who taught two spirited boys kindness instead of pride, patience instead of anger, and compassion instead of fear." Emma blinked in surprise. She had never imagined the Alpha King even knew her name. "Your Majesty," she answered softly, "I only cared for them because they needed someone who would listen." A warm smile, small but unmistakable, appeared on King Adrian's face. It was so unexpected that several longtime advisors quietly stared in disbelief. Those who had served beside him for years could scarcely remember the last time they had seen such genuine warmth soften his expression during a formal gathering. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, a quiet laugh escaped him. It was neither loud nor dramatic, but it was sincere. The sound seemed to lift the invisible weight that had hung over the hall all evening. Noah's face brightened instantly. Liam laughed as well, relieved beyond words. Even several servants exchanged hopeful smiles. King Adrian glanced toward the slightly crooked centerpiece, the misplaced bread wolves, and the half-moved dessert cart before looking once more at Emma. Perhaps, he said with gentle amusement, this royal dinner was not ruined after all. Perhaps it simply reminded its king of something far more important than perfect manners. A palace can be built with stone, but only kindness can make it feel like a home. The warmth that had returned to the hall did not fade when King Adrian finished speaking. Instead, it seemed to spread quietly from one person to another, softening expressions that had remained formal only moments before. The palace steward, who had spent weeks worrying about flawless etiquette, found himself remembering something he had nearly forgotten. Every morning before sunrise, he had often seen fresh flowers already waiting in the nursery without ever discovering who had placed them there. An elderly housekeeper suddenly stepped forward, her hands folded respectfully. "Your Majesty," she said, "if I may speak." King Adrian gave a gentle nod. "Please do." The woman looked toward Emma with kind eyes. 3 winters ago, when illness spread through the children's wing, Miss Carter stayed awake for nearly 3 nights. She never asked for recognition. She simply sat beside frightened little ones, read stories until they slept, and quietly prepared warm soup when the cooks had already gone home. Another servant slowly raised his hand. She also repaired broken toys instead of throwing them away. I thought the nursery had been receiving new gifts, but it was always Miss Carter working after her duties were finished. A young gardener smiled shyly before adding his own memory. The palace gardens became brighter because she asked me to plant flowers where the children played. She said every child deserved something beautiful to remember on difficult days. One voice became another. Then, another. The royal librarian recalled how Emma borrowed simple storybooks every week before returning them with tiny handwritten notes about which adventures made Noah and Liam laugh the hardest. A kitchen assistant admitted that Emma quietly shared portions of her own meals whenever another servant missed dinner because of extra work. None of these moments had ever appeared in official reports because Emma had never believed kindness deserved applause. She simply considered it part of ordinary life. Noah listened proudly, his little chest rising with every new story. Liam smiled through happy tears as though the entire palace had finally begun seeing the Emma they had always known. King Adrian remained silent, while every memory settled into place like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered for far too long. He realized the strongest influence inside Blackwood Palace had never worn a jeweled crown or carried a royal title. It had walked quietly through the corridors in a simple gray uniform, leaving warmth wherever it passed. Emma's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as every kind word turned more attention toward her. "Please," she said softly, "everyone here has done wonderful things. I only happen to be nearby." The elderly housekeeper smiled gently. "That is exactly the difference, my dear. You are always nearby whenever someone needs hope." Those simple words filled the hall with thoughtful silence once again. King Adrian looked toward the hundreds of guests gathered beneath the glowing chandeliers, then back to Emma. He finally understood why 2 lively wolf pups had risked disrupting the most important dinner of the year. They had not been trying to challenge royal tradition. They had simply refused to let the kindest person in the palace spend another evening believing she was invisible. King Adrian slowly turned toward the head table where a single empty chair rested beside his own, reserved for honored guests who had never arrived. For years it had remained untouched throughout every royal banquet, more a symbol of tradition than a place for any living person. Tonight he looked at it differently. He raised one hand, and the entire hall became perfectly still once again. "Emma Carter," he said, his voice calm and unwavering, "please come forward." Emma blinked in surprise and instinctively glanced behind her, almost expecting another Emma to appear from the crowd. When she realized he truly meant her, she quietly stepped forward, her hands folded respectfully. "Your Majesty?" she asked, barely above a whisper. King Adrian looked directly into her eyes. "Tonight I have listened to my nephews. I have listened to my household. More importantly, I have listened to the truth." He slowly gestured toward the empty chair beside his own. A quiet gasp spread across the dining hall. Even Lady Beatrice could not hide her astonishment. No servant, and certainly no Omega without noble rank, had ever been invited to sit beside the Alpha King during a formal royal banquet. Emma immediately shook her head. "Your Majesty, I cannot. My place is among the staff." King Adrian answered with gentle certainty. "That may have been where you served. It is not where your kindness belongs." Emma stood speechless, searching for the proper words, but none came. Noah and Liam could no longer contain themselves. They rushed forward, each taking one of Emma's hands with bright smiles that returned the light to her face. "Please come," Noah pleaded. "Now everyone will finally see you." Liam nodded enthusiastically. "And nobody can make you stand in the back anymore." A soft ripple of warm laughter spread through the hall. It was no longer uncomfortable. It sounded like relief. King Adrian waited patiently until Emma took one careful step toward the royal table. Then another. Every guest watched in respectful silence as she approached the empty chair. She hesitated once more before sitting, still uncertain whether she truly belonged there. The Alpha King noticed her hesitation and quietly moved her place, setting a little closer so she would not feel like an outsider at the edge of the table. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, yet everyone noticed it. The musicians slowly resumed their melody. Servants returned to their duties with lighter hearts than before. Conversation gradually filled the hall again, but it sounded different. Now, the evening no longer revolved around flawless etiquette or polished appearances. Instead, guests found themselves speaking about generosity, family, and the surprising wisdom of children. Lady Beatrice lowered her eyes for a thoughtful moment before offering Emma a respectful nod across the table. It was not dramatic, but it was sincere. Emma returned the gesture with her usual gentle smile, holding no bitterness. King Adrian looked around the magnificent hall and realized the atmosphere had changed in a way that no careful planning could ever achieve. The finest moment of the evening had not been created by expensive decorations or perfect ceremonies. It had been created by two small wolf pups who believed that making one kind heart smile was important enough to change an entire room. 1 year later, the royal dinner returned to Blackwood Palace beneath the same sparkling chandeliers, the same towering banners, and the same beautifully prepared tables. Yet anyone who had attended the previous banquet immediately sensed that something important had changed. The palace no longer felt like a place where silence carried more value than kindness. It felt warmer, brighter, and wonderfully alive. At the center of that quiet transformation sat Emma Carter, no longer hiding behind rows of servants or disappearing into crowded hallways. She wore a simple but elegant royal blue gown chosen not for wealth or status, but as a symbol of appreciation from the household she had helped shape with nothing more than patience and compassion. Noah and Liam rushed through the hall with the same endless energy they had always possessed, but now no one frowned when they laughed too loudly or stopped to hug the palace staff. They had learned proper manners, yet they had never lost the joyful hearts Emma had protected. Every servant smiled when the boys greeted them by name. Every gardener received a cheerful wave. Every musician was thanked before the first note of the evening was played. King Adrian quietly watched it all from his place at the head of the table. His kingdom had not become stronger because its walls had grown higher or its ceremonies more impressive. It had become stronger because kindness had finally been recognized as a form of leadership. During the evening meal, Noah suddenly held up one of the tiny bread wolves that the royal bakers now prepared every year in honor of the unforgettable banquet. Liam laughed and placed another beside Emma's plate before proudly declaring that some traditions deserve to last forever. The entire hall answered with warm laughter. Even Lady Beatrice smiled without hesitation this time, raising her glass in a graceful salute toward Emma before taking another sip. Emma looked around the magnificent room, hardly believing how much life could change because two little wolf pups had refused to let her sadness go unnoticed. She smiled not because she had finally been seen, but because everyone around her had learned to truly see one another. King Adrian lifted his glass and spoke only one sentence, yet every person in the hall remembered it long after the candles burned low. The greatest crown any kingdom can wear is a compassionate heart. A peaceful silence followed, not empty but full of gratitude. Outside, the moon shone gently above Blackwood Palace, while laughter drifted through the open windows into the quiet night, reminding anyone willing to listen that true strength is gentle, true family is built through kindness, and sometimes the smallest act of love can change an entire kingdom forever.